The nails had barely cooled in the wood when something invisible began ticking. It was the spring of AD 33, a quick killing on the dusty fringe of the empire, arranged to restore order, protect the tax flow, and keep Rome's boots firmly on the necks of an unstable province. The men who signed off on it, a prefect hiding behind his basin of water, priests cloaked in linen and power, a hollowed-out emperor drinking himself to death on a Mediterranean rock, told themselves the matter was closed. One more carpenter's corpse on a Judean hill. They convinced themselves they had strangled a peasant movement in its cradle. They were catastrophically wrong. What they had actually done was carve their own names into the ledger of the dead. There was no curse, no thundercloud, no divine hand reaching down from the sky. What came for them was something far colder: politics. The very empire they bled for turned on every single one of them. Fortunes confiscated overnight, pillows pressed over sleeping faces, names scratched off Senate rolls, exile to islands so remote that madness arrived before the ships did, knives in alleyways held by the same bodyguards they had trained to love them. The silence they bought on that Friday afternoon curdled into something monstrous, a paranoia that climbed the imperial ladder one rung at a time and strangled every man who had touched the trial. What you are about to watch is the quiet unraveling of the men who ran the ancient world. An emperor smothered in his own bedsheets. A governor vanished into the fog of history with a rope around his conscience. A high priest dragged from his mansion. A holy city reduced to ash and melted gold. A temple so thoroughly dismantled that its stones were pried apart for the gold that ran between them. This is what happened next. Not the sermon, not the legend, the geopolitical body count. There are no saints in this story, only powerful men who believed they could outmaneuver the machine that fed them, and learned one by one that the machine always eats its own. Before we descend into it, drop the city and country you are watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button to keep this channel alive. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand the slow poisoning that consumed every hand that touched the cross that morning, you need to stop looking at the wooden beams planted outside Jerusalem. You need to turn your eyes west, far west, to a jagged piece of limestone jutting out of the Mediterranean like a broken tooth. The execution in Judea in the spring of AD 33 was not a flex of Roman muscle. It was an act of pure administrative panic. Pontius Pilate did not approve the nails because he was powerful. He approved them because he was cornered. He was a glorified bureaucrat in a violent multinational corporation, and he understood something most modern managers will never understand. A bad quarterly report in the Roman Empire did not end your career. It ended your life. And the man who would be reading that report was currently hiding inside a cliffside fortress on the island of Capri, drinking watered wine and sleeping with a knife under his pillow. The Rome of AD 33 was not the Rome of marble columns and philosophy scrolls that the schoolbooks sell you. That is the Disneyland version. The real Rome was a protection racket with legions. The provinces were not subjects. They were revenue streams. They existed to be bled. Judea was one of the ugliest accounts on the ledger. A strip of heat-cracked earth filled with zealots, prophets, and tax-evading peasants who refused to bow to anyone but their invisible God. It produced almost nothing of value. It consumed legions. Pilate was the regional manager of this disaster. His job description was 2 sentences long: extract the silver, kill the noise. He had already failed spectacularly on both fronts. He had marched imperial banners stamped with the emperor's face into the sacred city. and the population nearly tore the walls down in response. He had dipped his hand into the temple treasury to fund a public works project, and the protest that followed ended with Roman clubs shattering the skulls of unarmed Jews in the streets of Jerusalem. Pilate's file in Rome was getting thick. Every incident report was another shovel of dirt on his future grave, and every decision he made traveled on a knife's edge of delay. A dispatch leaving the docks at Caesarea Maritima could take 4 to 6 weeks to reach the imperial peninsula. The ship had to survive storms, pirates, and the brutal autumn crosswinds before unloading at Puteoli. From there, horsemen carried the wax tablets north. By the time a command returned to Judea, the facts on the ground had already mutated into something else. This lag created a specific psychological poison. You never truly knew who was running Rome on any given day. You could be loyally serving a master who had been murdered 3 weeks ago by his own cook. You could be executing orders from a dead man and not find out until the assassins were already kicking in your door. The man whose name hung over Pilate like a sword was Tiberius Caesar Augustus, 74 years old. Rotting slowly in his private kingdom of stone, he had abandoned Rome itself, walked away from the Senate, walked away from the Forum. He left the greatest city on earth to the rats and the politicians and retreated to the island of Capri, where he built 12 private villas along the cliffs. The largest, Villa Jovis, perched on a sheer drop of 1,000 feet, with the sea grinding the rocks below. Only one narrow path led up to it, easy to defend with a handful of men. He installed a system of polished bronze mirrors on the cliff edge to flash coded signals to the mainland. He did not hide because he was a coward. He hid because he had already watched too many emperors die in their own bedrooms, their blood pooling on mosaic floors. He had internalized the oldest lesson of empire. The closer you are to power, the closer the knives. Tiberius was a decaying god-king. His face was a ruin of open sores, crusted skin, and peeling flesh, most likely a severe chronic skin disease that forced his physicians to pack his cheeks with stinking medicinal pastes. He walked with the stiff, brittle shuffle of a man whose spine no longer trusted him. In his youth, he had been one of the finest military commanders the empire had ever produced, grinding the Germanic tribes into submission along the Rhine. But 74 years of imperial politics had whittled that sharp mind down to a single splinter of suspicion. He did not govern through speeches. He governed through the treason laws. These were called the Maesta's trials, and they were written to catch anyone for anything at any time. A senator could be dragged from his couch at dinner because he had carried a coin bearing the emperor's face into a toilet. A nobleman was executed because he changed his tunic while standing near a marble statue of Augustus. The system ran on professional accusers called delatores, informers who received a cut of the condemned man's estate as their reward. This one mechanism alone rotted the Roman aristocracy from the inside. Fathers informed on sons, wives whispered on husbands. Household slaves sold out their masters for a silver handful and a chance at freedom. Every senator in Rome slept lightly. Every knock on the door after midnight was the last sound some of them ever heard. This was the specific flavor of terror that flowed downstream into Pilate's office. And Pilate was dirty in a very particular way. He had not been appointed by Tiberius directly. He had been installed by a man named Lucius alias Sejanus. Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard and the de facto ruler of Rome while Tiberius rotted on Capri. Sejanus packed the provincial administration with his own loyalists, building a silent empire inside the empire. Pilate was one of his men. Pilate's ambitions, his paycheck, his future, all of it flowed through Sejanus. Then, in AD 31, 2 years before the cross went up on Golgotha, a letter reached Capri. A woman named Antonia, the mother of Germanicus, had pieced together evidence that Sejanus was preparing to remove Tiberius and take the throne himself. The emperor's response was a masterpiece of cold theater. He did not strike openly. He summoned Sejanus to the Senate on a routine morning, allowing the man to believe he was about to be granted new honors, perhaps even the tribunician power itself. Sejanus walked into the chamber smiling. A long letter from Capri was unrolled and read aloud. It meandered at first, praising and thanking, before shifting tone, and then, in a single sentence, denouncing Sejanus as a traitor. The guards turned on him within seconds. He was dragged to the Tullianum, the underground strangling cell, and garroted before nightfall. His corpse was hauled out with meat hooks, paraded through the streets, and hurled down the Gemonian stairs, where it was torn apart by a crowd and left to rot under the sun for days. Tiberius was not done. He ordered a full purge of every man connected to Sejanus. Because ancient Roman religious law forbade the execution of a virgin, the executioner was ordered to rape the man's young daughter before the cord was placed around her small throat. This was not an anomaly. This was standard procedure. This was the apparatus Pilate worked for. This was the management structure he reported into. So when the Jewish high priests, standing in the courtyard of the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem, turned to him and spoke the words, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar," they were not making a theological appeal. They were driving a blade directly into his ribs. The phrase "friend of Caesar" was not a compliment. It was a formal title that indicated personal loyalty to the emperor. To publicly question a man's status as a friend of Caesar was to open a file. To open a file was to invite an audit from Capri, and an audit from Capri for a Sejanus appointee like Pilate meant a one-way ticket to the strangling cell. The priests understood the exact mechanism of his fear, and they pulled the lever with surgical precision. Pilate looked at the battered man standing in the dust of the courtyard. He looked at the priests gripping the political leverage. The calculation was simple and ugly. One dead preacher from a backwater town meant the paperwork stayed clean. A riot meant a letter to Capri. A letter to Capri meant a Roman executioner stepping off a ship at Caesarea Maritima, with orders bearing the imperial seal. Pilate called for the basin. He washed his hands. The water did not wash his conscience, because he did not have one. The water was a signal. The transaction was complete. The nails were driven. The reports were written. The year ended. Pilate was still breathing. He believed, for a moment, that he had outmaneuvered the machine. What he had actually done was bet everything he owned on the health of a dying man 1,500 miles away. And the dying man was about to die. 4 years passed. Spring, AD 37. The imperial court finally peeled itself off the cliffs of Capri. Tiberius was 78 years old. His kidneys were failing. His breathing had become a wet, bubbling rattle. His skin hung off his bones like old curtain fabric. He was carried slowly up the Campanian coastline, stopping at imperial estates along the way, trailed by a caravan of physicians, political advisors, guards, and career parasites waiting for the throne to change hands. The caravan finally stopped at a sprawling villa overlooking the bay at Misenum, a palace originally built by the general Lucullus during the dying days of the Republic. The walls were thick. The guards were doubled. But the real threat to the emperor was not outside the walls. It was standing a few feet from his bed. The man watching Tiberius wither was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History remembers him by his childhood camp nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. He was 24 years old, and he was the last male survivor of a family slaughter that Tiberius himself had orchestrated. Tiberius had engineered the deaths of Caligula's mother Agrippina, starved to death in exile, and of his two older brothers, both destroyed through the treason trial machinery. Caligula had then been summoned personally to Capri as a teenager, not as a guest, but as a hostage with a title. He spent 6 years of his adolescence living under the same roof as the man who had systematically dismantled his entire family. Caligula did what no teenage boy should ever have to do. He learned to perform. He swallowed every scream. He buried every instinct for revenge under layers of flattery. He smiled at the executioner of his mother. He laughed at the jokes of the man who had starved his brothers. He stood silently when prisoners were thrown from the cliffs of Capri into the sea below. He watched. He studied. He became a perfect mirror, reflecting back to Tiberius only the image the old emperor wanted to see. A harmless boy, a loyal grandson, a future echo of the current regime. Tiberius was not completely fooled. He once muttered to his inner circle that he was raising a serpent for the Roman people. But the Julio-Claudian bloodline was running dry. The heirs had been butchered, exiled, or discredited. Caligula was essentially the last name on the list. Standing to the right of Caligula was Naevius Sutorius Macro. He was the new prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the same position Sejanus had once held. Macro was the man who had personally orchestrated the arrest and execution of Sejanus 6 years earlier. He was not a romantic. He was not an idealist. He was a political mechanic forged inside the gears of the empire, and he understood a single immutable law. When power shifts in Rome, you move with it in the same instant, or it crushes you under the wheel. Macro looked at the gray hue of Tiberius's cheeks. He listened to the wet drag of the old man's breath. He calculated that the emperor had hours left, not days. To guarantee his own seat at the new table, Macro bound himself completely to Caligula. He went further than loyalty. He delivered his own wife, Ennia Thrasilla, to Caligula's bed, cementing the political alliance with a transaction of flesh. On March 16, AD 37, something shifted in the air of the villa at Misenum. The emperor's personal physician, Charicles, approached the bed under the pretext of taking his leave for the evening. He kissed the old man's hand, a gesture of respect, while pressing 2 fingers against the inside of the wrist. The pulse was thready, stuttering, nearly gone. Charicles stepped back from the bed and made eye contact with Macro across the chamber. He gave a small, almost invisible nod. The physician then quietly announced to the court that Tiberius would not survive the next 48 hours. The succession machine detonated into motion. The corridors of the villa filled with whispered orders. Household slaves began quietly packing chests and removing valuables. Senators who had bowed to the old emperor for decades suddenly drifted away from his door, as if the room itself had caught fire. The imperial signet ring, the heavy gold band that carried the seal of absolute global authority, was carefully eased off the emperor's limp finger while he slept. The ring was carried across the atrium and placed into the hand of Caligula. He slid it onto his own finger. The weight was immediate and physical, not just metal, but meaning. He stepped out of the private quarters and into the open hall. The Praetorian guards raised their spears and struck their shields in the hail of a new emperor. The courtiers dropped to their knees across the marble floor. They shouted his name. The relief in that hall was almost sexual. The long, paranoid winter of Tiberius was finally ending. A young prince, a victim of the old tyrant, was about to inherit the throne. The sun was rising over Rome again. Then the doors of the bedchamber crashed open. A terrified slave came running into the atrium, his face the color of cold ash. Every voice in the hall died instantly. The slave forced out a single sentence that stopped the blood in every body present. Tiberius had opened his eyes. Tiberius was sitting up. Tiberius was asking for food. Tiberius was looking at his bare finger and demanding to know who had taken his ring. The horror of that moment lives beyond description. Every single courtier, senator, and guard in that atrium had just committed high treason. Celebrating the accession of a new emperor, while the previous one still drew breath, was not a minor infraction. It was a capital crime. It did not get a trial. It got a blade. The men who had been kissing the hem of Caligula's robe seconds earlier began physically backing away from him across the marble floor. They suddenly could not remember anything. They stared at the mosaics under their feet. They pretended to be inspecting columns. They were already mentally composing the denials they would scream while being dragged to the cliffs. Caligula stood frozen in the center of the hall. The ring on his finger now felt like a brand of hot iron. Walking into that bedchamber and handing it back would be a confession. Tiberius would see the guilt in his eyes. Tiberius would smell the ambition on his skin. The old tyrant would command Macro, with a single gesture, to open the young man's throat on the bedroom floor. The serpent had been exposed, and it had not yet grown its fangs. Macro did not freeze. Macro never froze. The commander of the Praetorian Guard ran the situation through a cold, brutal algorithm. The transfer of power could not be reversed. If Tiberius recovered, even for a day, every man in that hall was dead, and Macro would be strangled first. The emperor had transformed, in the span of a single servant's sentence, from a fading asset into an existential liability to the Roman state itself. Waiting for nature to complete its work was no longer an available option. Macro waved the panicked crowd out of the corridor. He dismissed the guards posted at the chamber door. He cleared the approach to the room with the efficiency of a man setting up a crime scene. He then walked back into the bedchamber. Alone, Tiberius was trying to prop himself upright against the pillows. His voice was a thin, cracked wheeze. He was asking for his ring. He was asking for his physician. He was asking why no one had answered his bell. The room smelled of stale sweat, incense, and the faintly sulfuric stench of medicinal ointments. Macro did not respond to any of it. He did not greet the emperor. He did not bow. He walked, without a word, to a low wooden chest in the corner of the room where the extra blankets were stored. The commander turned back toward the bed. He was holding a thick stack of heavy woolen blankets in his arms. He unfolded them slowly as he walked. Tiberius looked up, and something in the fog of his dying mind registered clearly for the first time in days. This was not a servant bringing comfort. This was something else. The old emperor's mouth opened to scream, but there was not enough air left in his lungs to push the sound out. Macro was already on him. He threw the full weight of the blankets across the emperor's face. He leaned forward, planted both palms flat on the wool, and pressed down with the entire mass of his upper body. There was no blood, no drawn blade, no dramatic final words. The killing of the most powerful man on earth was a muffled, fabric-smothered struggle. Beneath the heavy wool, the fingers of Tiberius Caesar clawed at the linen sheets beneath him. His brittle heels drummed against the mattress. He tried to twist his head sideways to find an opening, any gap, any pocket of air. But Macro's grip was a set of iron bands. The commander held the pressure steady for several long minutes, ignoring the spasms, ignoring the muffled grunts, ignoring the way the old man's hands scraped and clutched, and finally fell still. The legs kicked twice, then once more, then nothing. Macro held the weight down for another full minute, because Macro had not risen through the ranks of the Praetorian Guard by being sloppy. When he finally lifted the blankets, the face of Tiberius Caesar Augustus was slack and blue at the lips. The architect of the Maestas trials, the man who had built the most sophisticated system of legal terror in the ancient world, had been quietly smothered in his own bedsheets by the security chief he had personally appointed. Macro folded the blankets. He placed them back in the chest. He straightened his tunic. He walked out of the chamber, found Caligula still standing frozen in the atrium, and gave him a single, short nod. The transfer of power was now irreversible. Before we follow the shockwave of this murder across the sea to the eastern provinces and watch it slam into the spine of Pontius Pilate, I want to talk to the real ones in this audience. You are still watching this deep into the video because you already know history is not a collection of polite anniversaries. It is a running body count. If you want to go further into the archive, deeper into the blood, it is time to take the next step. Hit the join button below this video and step into the lineage. This is the membership tier of this channel. Joining is not a tip. It is fuel. It funds the research, pays for the production, and puts you inside the inner circle of the best dark history community on the internet. You get early access to investigations before anyone else, exclusive member badges, and the quiet satisfaction of keeping this machine running. Join the lineage now. All right. Back to the blood. The sealed dispatch left Misenum within hours of Tiberius, drawing his last muffled breath. It crossed the Tyrrhenian, caught the trade winds past Sicily, and moved east along the old grain routes toward the province of Syria. Weeks later, the ship slid into the harbor at Caesarea Maritima. A Roman courier, caked in dust from the coastal road, placed a sealed wax tablet directly into the hand of Pontius Pilate. Pilate broke the seal. He read the 8 or 9 Latin words that rearranged his entire life. Tiberius was dead. Caligula wore the purple. The prefect of Judea felt every degree of warmth drain out of the room. The political shield that had protected his career for 10 years had just evaporated over the course of a single afternoon, in a villa he had never visited, in a room he would never see. He had crucified a provincial teacher 4 years earlier to keep a regime satisfied. That regime no longer existed. The man now sitting on the throne was a 24-year-old with a long memory, a private hatred of his own family's killers, and a new habit of staring across the empire and marking down exactly which governors, which prefects, which bureaucrats belonged to the old Rome that had murdered his mother and brothers. Pilate was now standing completely in the open, and in Rome, the boots of new executioners were already turning east. The Mediterranean sun does not negotiate, but it does hand out a very convincing lie. It tells the men who live under it that the world revolves around them. For decades, the Roman governors who ran the eastern provinces swallowed that lie whole. They surrounded themselves with cedar furniture, imported silk from Damascus, perfumed oils from Arabia, and the thick smoke of incense that hung permanently in their reception halls. They looked in the polished silver mirrors and saw permanent fixtures of the imperial order staring back at them. They were wrong in the way only powerful men can be wrong. Rome did not see them that way. Rome saw them the way a butcher sees a chicken. Useful until the moment they weren't. When the political wind changed direction back in Italy, the empire did not simply dismiss its eastern administrators. It buried them. It dragged them out of their marble palaces and flung them into the coldest, rainiest, most forgotten corners of the known world to rot anonymously in the mud. And the first man to fall off that cliff was the one who had stood in the courtyard in Jerusalem 4 years earlier and asked for a basin of water. Pontius Pilate did not lose his command because of what happened on that Friday afternoon outside the city walls. That event did not register in Rome. A single crucifixion in a backwater province was paperwork, nothing more. No Roman senator lost a minute of sleep over the death of a Galilean carpenter. Pilate lost his command because he overreacted during a completely unrelated religious gathering 3 years later, and he did it in the worst possible political season. It was the winter of AD 36. A charismatic Samaritan preacher had been traveling through the villages clustered around Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans shared the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures with the Jews, but they worshipped on a rival mountain, and they considered Gerizim, not Jerusalem, to be the true holy site. This preacher, whose name the sources never even bothered to preserve, had convinced a large and growing crowd that he knew the precise location where Moses himself had buried the sacred vessels of the original tabernacle. He told them to gather at a village called Tirathana. From there, they would climb the mountain together, unearth the relics, and usher in a new golden age of divine favor. The gathering was big. Thousands of men, women, and children. And because the roads through the hills were crawling with bandits, many of the men showed up carrying iron swords. Pilate looked at Tirathana and saw an armed insurrection. His nerves were shot. He had spent 10 years walking a tightrope in Judea, and his patron in Rome, Sejanus, was long dead and dishonored. Every small disturbance in the province threatened to produce a negative dispatch to Capri. He did not send a small patrol to monitor the gathering. He did not negotiate. He did not send heralds to disperse the crowd. He deployed heavy cavalry. Roman auxiliary horsemen crashed into the village before the Samaritans had even begun to climb the mountain. What followed was not a battle. A cavalry charge into an unarmored civilian crowd is an industrial process, not a fight. The horses broke the crowd in the first pass. The riders used long cavalry swords to cut down the pilgrims as they tried to scramble up the ravines. The dust turned black with blood. Hundreds were killed where they stood. Pilate dragged the surviving leaders back to Caesarea Maritima in chains and had them publicly beheaded in the square in front of his headquarters. He wrote up the incident as a decisive suppression of a rebel uprising. He believed he had reinforced his image as a hardline imperial operator. He had actually handed his enemies the exact knife they needed to bury in his back. The Samaritan elders did not bother appealing to Pilate. They walked around him entirely. They sent a delegation north to Antioch, the provincial capital of Syria, and they requested an audience with Lucius Vitellius. Vitellius was the legate of Syria, the senior Roman official in the entire eastern Mediterranean. He was a man of old aristocratic blood, immense political skill, and absolute ruthlessness when it came to managing downward. He outranked Pilate by several orders of magnitude. Vitellius listened to the Samaritan account of the massacre at Gerizim with polite attention. He saw an opportunity drop directly into his lap. Pilate was a leftover from the disgraced Sejanus faction. Vitellius wanted his own men running Judea, controlling the tax flows, and answering directly to him. Cleaning out Pilate solved a political problem and pleased the locals in one stroke. Vitellius sent his personal friend Marcellus south to take operational control of Judea. He ordered Pilate to pack up his household, board the next available ship, and sail for Italy to personally answer to the emperor for the slaughter at Tirathana. Pilate boarded a merchant vessel at the worst possible time of year. Winter sailing on the Mediterranean in antiquity was close to suicide. The skies were ruled by sudden, violent storms that could tear the rigging off a ship in minutes. Captains hugged the coastlines like terrified children, limping from port to port, sometimes waiting weeks in a single harbor for the wind to turn. Pilate sat inside the creaking wooden hull for months, staring at the same salt-crusted planks, running through his defense over and over in his head. He had time to rehearse every phrase. He had time to polish every justification. He finally stepped off the gangplank at the Italian port of Puteoli in the spring of AD 37. He walked off the dock straight into a crowd shouting the news that had exploded out of Misenum only days earlier. Tiberius was dead. Caligula wore the ring. The trap closed around Pilate's ankles before he even reached the road to Rome. Every word of his rehearsed defense was now garbage. His entire argument had been constructed for an emperor who no longer existed. He was walking into the throne room of a 24-year-old who viewed every single appointee of the old regime as either a potential enemy or a convenient source of confiscated silver. Caligula had no patience for the political logic of the previous decade. He did not care why Pilate had done what he had done. He only cared who had placed Pilate in that office in the first place. And the answer to that question was a man who had been strangled in the Tullianum 6 years earlier. Pilate was stripped of his prefecture. He was stripped of his equestrian rank, the social class that had defined his entire adult identity. He was forbidden from retiring to his own estates in Italy. Caligula signed the exile order without ceremony. Pilate was sent to Gaul. The historical tradition places his banishment in the city of Vienne, sitting on the banks of the Rhone River, in what is now southeastern France. The geography was not random. Rome exiled its enemies to climates and landscapes specifically engineered to break their minds before their bodies gave out. The sensory transition from the Levant to Gaul would have been a form of slow torture. Pilate traded the smell of hot limestone, olive presses, and dry desert wind for the endless stench of wet pine, rotting leaves, and damp earth. The cold of the Rhone Valley does not hit you in the skin. It burrows straight into the joints and stays there. It is a gnawing, constant ache that settles in the hips, the knees, the shoulders. A man who had commanded cohorts of armed Roman soldiers now sat in a drafty wooden cabin listening to rain hammer the roof for weeks without pause. He wore rough native wool instead of imported Egyptian linen. He spent his days watching the gray river water drag itself south toward a Mediterranean he would never see again. Isolation is a poison that works slowly, in small doses. He had no command. He had no correspondence. He had no audience to perform for. He was a ghost haunting a freezing forest. But Caligula's paranoia did not remain static. It metastasized. By AD 39, the young emperor was systematically purging anyone who reminded him even slightly of the world his mother and brothers had died in. He began sending Praetorian assassins out to the provinces to tie off loose ends that were still breathing. Pilate had spent his entire career inside the imperial machine. He understood how the machine processed men like him. When he heard the synchronized heavy rhythm of Roman military boots coming up the path toward his wooden door one morning in Gaul, he did not wait for the knock. He knew what came next. He knew the script better than the soldiers did. Arrest meant being hauled back to Rome in iron chains. It meant a public trial engineered for humiliation. It meant a cord around the throat in the Tullianum and hooks in his heels dragging his body down the Gemonian stairs for the crowd to spit on. He chose to hold on to the only thing he had left, which was the timing of his own exit. He drew a hunting dagger from the wall. Roman suicide by blade requires a very specific anatomical precision. The point has to slip behind the collarbone at the correct angle and sever the carotid artery in one clean motion, because a botched attempt leaves you bleeding slowly for hours, with the soldiers watching. Pilate pressed the iron to his neck. He drove it in. The arterial spray painted the wooden floorboards in a wide fan. When the Praetorians finally kicked in the door, they found a man who had executed himself before they could get the paperwork started. The bureaucrat who had signed the order at Golgotha bled out face down in the mud of a European forest, 2,000 kilometers from the courtyard where he had washed his hands. But the paranoia did not die with Pilate in Gaul. It swept back across the Mediterranean with terrifying speed and found the next man on the list. It found the tetrarch who had lounged on a cushioned throne in Jerusalem that same Friday morning and mocked the prisoner before shipping him back to Pilate's praetorium. Herod Antipas was a survivor in every sense of the word. He was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. He had held on to his slice of the family inheritance for 4 full decades, which was a near miracle for anyone with Herodian blood. He was the son of Herod the Great, a bloodline defined by monumental architecture and domestic butchery in equal measure. Antipas had watched his own father execute 3 of his own sons purely on suspicion. He had grown up understanding that ambition was a terminal condition in his family, so he chose a different survival strategy. He focused on luxury, architecture, and the slow cultivation of Hellenistic culture in his sun-baked corner of the world. He wanted to transform his dusty territory into a polished jewel of the Greco-Roman East. He built a new capital city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. He named it Tiberius, an obvious monument of flattery aimed directly at the old emperor on Capri. The city was genuinely impressive. A stone stadium for games, a royal palace with a gilded roof that caught the sun from miles away. Natural hot springs pumped hot mineral water through marble channels into private bathhouses. It was a masterpiece of urban planning and Roman engineering. It also had a single, fatal, unfixable problem. During the digging of the foundations, the construction crews had torn up an enormous ancient Jewish cemetery. Tiberius had been built directly on top of an unmarked necropolis. Under Jewish religious law, contact with a corpse transmits the most severe form of ritual impurity. Simply entering the city rendered any observant Jew unclean for 7 days. They could not enter the temple. They could not pray in public. They could not touch sacred objects. The priests flatly refused to set foot inside the gates. The devout families of Galilee refused to even walk along the roads leading into it. Antipas had built a stunning golden city that the actual population of his province would not enter under any circumstance. He was reduced to populating it with bribery. He offered free real estate, tax exemptions, and full citizenship to beggars, freed slaves, foreign mercenaries, and any drifter willing to cross the threshold. He ended up ruling a capital full of opportunists, outcasts, and men with nothing to lose. Antipas might have coasted to the end of his reign and died of old age on his gilded roof if he had remained single. He did not. He married a woman named Herodias. Herodias was his own niece. She had already been married to his half-brother. She had divorced her first husband specifically to marry Antipas. This violated multiple layers of Jewish religious law at once, both incest prohibitions and the rules around legitimate divorce. The Jewish population of Galilee was openly disgusted. A desert preacher named John the Baptist began publicly condemning the marriage from the banks of the Jordan. Antipas arrested the preacher to silence him, but the arrest was not enough for Herodias. She was the one who engineered the execution, using her own daughter's dance at a royal banquet to extract from her drunk husband a promise that ended with John's severed head resting on a silver platter. Herodias was a woman driven by a clean, constant, surgical hunger for status. She wanted to be called a queen. Antipas was a tetrarch, which is to say, a quarter king. The title grated on her every single morning for years. Her ambition became lethal the day her brother came home. Her brother's name was Herod Agrippa, and he was a walking dumpster fire of bad decisions. He had been raised inside the imperial court in Rome. He had the right name, the right accent, the right connections, and absolutely zero financial self-control. He borrowed staggering amounts of silver from Roman senators, imperial freedmen, and Alexandrian bankers to bankroll a lifestyle designed for a man 3 times his actual wealth. When his creditors finally coordinated and came after him at the same time, Agrippa fled Italy in the middle of the night, 1 step ahead of the debt collectors. He slunk back to Judea broke, disgraced, and, according to contemporary accounts, actively contemplating suicide in a desert fortress, while his wife begged him to keep living. Herodias took pity on her ruined brother. She talked Antipas into giving him a minor administrative post in a small market town. Agrippa hated every minute of it. He could not stand taking orders from his sister's husband, collecting petty market taxes in a dusty backwater after having dined with consuls in Rome. He borrowed another round of silver from an Alexandrian banker, chartered a ship, and sailed back to Italy to roll the dice one more time. Agrippa had exactly one genuine gift. He knew how to attach himself to dangerous young men. He identified Caligula early and glued himself to the young prince. They drank together. They hunted together. They gambled into the small hours. One night, during a carriage ride through the Italian countryside, Agrippa, deep in his cups, loudly expressed his wish that the old Emperor Tiberius would hurry up and die so that his friend Caligula could take the throne. The carriage driver, a freedman named Eutychus, heard every word. Months later, during a legal dispute, the driver reported the treasonous comment to the imperial intelligence apparatus. Tiberius had Agrippa stripped of his fine clothes, wrapped in heavy iron chains, and thrown into a prison cell. Agrippa sat in that cell for 6 straight months, waiting every morning for the sound of the executioner's footsteps. They never came. Something else came instead. The old man in Misnum stopped breathing. Caligula took the ring. Among the first things he did was remember his drinking buddy rotting in a prison cell. He ordered Agrippa released on the spot. He personally draped a purple robe over the bankrupt prince's shoulders. He ordered the imperial smiths to melt down the exact iron chain Agrippa had worn in prison and recast it in solid gold, bar for bar, link for link, weighing it out on a scale so that the new chain matched the old one to the ounce. Then Caligula unrolled a map. He drew a line across the territories north of Galilee. He handed them to Agrippa. He gave him the title of king. Agrippa sailed east. The man who had been dodging creditors in Italian back alleys a few years earlier now paraded along the shores of the Sea of Galilee in a royal diadem, trailed by Roman bodyguards, his new gold chain catching the sun. Herodias watched the procession from the gilded roof of her palace in Tiberias. Something inside her snapped. The sight of her useless, bankrupt, failed brother parading past her palace, wearing an actual crown, was more than her pride could process. She turned on Antipas. She started on him the same evening. She nagged him through dinner. She mocked his tetrarch title. She demanded to know how a man who had ruled for 40 years could sit there eating figs while a walking bankruptcy case outranked him. She insisted they load the treasury, charter a ship, sail to Italy, and demand a royal title directly from Caligula's hand. Antipas resisted for as long as he could. He was old. He genuinely hated sea travel. He understood imperial politics in a way his ambitious wife did not. He knew the oldest rule of survival under the Julio Claudians. You do not ask Rome for favors. You pray Rome forgets your name. Drawing the direct personal attention of a volatile young emperor was a catastrophic mistake. But Herodias did not stop. The pressure built inside that palace for months, until it became unbearable. In the spring of AD 39, Antipas finally folded. They loaded an enormous fortune in silver, gold, and imperial gifts onto a ship and pointed the bow at Italy. They did not know that Agrippa had already moved first. Agrippa had learned of his sister's voyage the moment the ship left port. He knew exactly why Antipas was sailing west. He knew Antipas wanted a crown. And Agrippa wanted the Galilee for himself. It was geographically adjacent to his own territories. Combined, the two regions would form a nearly continuous Herodian kingdom under his name. He sat down and drafted a letter. He gave it to his most trusted freedman, a man named Fortunatus, with explicit instructions. Take the fastest imperial dispatch vessel available. Beat Antipas to Italy. Put this letter directly into the emperor's hand before the tetrarch can open his mouth. The imperial court that spring was not in Rome. It was at Baiae, the playground of the Roman super-elite, a volcanic coastline of luxury villas, sulfur hot springs, and whispered conspiracies built along the Bay of Naples. Caligula was relaxing at his seaside palace there when Fortunatus's ship pulled into the harbor. The freedman was ushered into the emperor's presence. He handed over the sealed wax tablet. Caligula cracked the seal open. Agrippa's letter was a surgical masterpiece of political murder. It did not mention Herodias. It did not mention the crown. It did not mention the ambition driving the voyage. Instead, it opened with a treason accusation. It informed the emperor that Antipas had been a secret ally of the executed traitor Sejanus years earlier. Worse, the letter claimed that Antipas was currently negotiating, in secret, a military alliance with King Artabanus of Parthia, Rome's most dangerous enemy on the eastern frontier. And then, the letter delivered its killing detail. It stated a single, verifiable fact. It informed Caligula that Antipas had spent years quietly stockpiling weapons inside his Galilean armories, and that those armories currently contained enough military equipment to outfit 70,000 infantry. Hours later, Antipas himself arrived at the villa. He walked into the reception hall smiling, expecting to discuss titles, honors, and the fine print of a royal promotion. Caligula was already seated, holding the open letter loosely between two fingers. The emperor skipped every pleasantry. He looked up at the old tetrarch and asked a single, clean, clinical question. Was it true that Antipas currently had enough weapons in his armories to equip an army of 70,000 men? Antipas froze in place. The answer to that question was a physical reality that could be verified by any Roman inspector within a matter of weeks. The weapons existed. He could not deny it. He stammered something about local bandits and provincial defense. It was the wrong answer, and both men in the room knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Caligula required no further information. A provincial ruler stockpiling arms for 70,000 soldiers was not preparing for bandits. He was preparing for something much bigger. The trial, if you could even call it that, took less than 2 minutes. Caligula stripped Antipas of his tetrarchy on the spot. He seized the entire treasury that Antipas had just sailed into port with. He banned him from ever setting foot in the eastern half of the empire again. He awarded every inch of Galilean territory and every piece of confiscated gold to Agrippa. Then the emperor looked at Herodias, still standing in silence at her husband's side. He noted, with something like amusement, that she was Agrippa's sister. He offered her a full pardon. She could keep her personal estates, her jewelry, her freedom, and return quietly to Judea to live under the protection of her newly promoted brother. Herodias stared at the young tyrant on the throne. Her pride had not bent even an inch. She refused the pardon. She chose to follow her broken husband into the dark. They were sent to Lugdunum Convenarum. It was a cold, isolated Roman settlement tucked into the foothills of the Pyrenees, close to the border of Hispania. The man who had built a golden city on top of a graveyard was now forced to walk on foot through the freezing mountains of Western Europe. Antipas and Herodias exchanged the hot desert winds of Galilee for the constant, bone-deep rain of the Pyrenees. There were no servants. There was no silver. There was no court. They were surrounded by indigenous Aquitanian tribes who could not have cared less about the politics of the Levant or the gossip of the Roman court. Antipas, old and unaccustomed to the damp climate, contracted a lung infection within the first winter. His chest filled with fluid. He spent the final weeks of his life coughing thick red phlegm into the frozen mud outside a wooden hut. A Herodian king of the East died as an unknown peasant in the far west, buried in an unmarked grave among strangers who did not speak his language. The nest of vipers had eaten itself alive. Before we walk into the final apocalyptic phase of this story, the moment when the Roman legions came for the holy city itself, I want to direct your attention to the screen. Look just below this video. You will see a button labeled View Products. Click it. There is a book waiting for you on that page. This volume is not light reading. It is a dense, meticulous archive of political terror in the first-century Roman Empire, documenting the exact mechanisms, the forensic realities, and the blood-soaked purges that shaped the world this story unfolds in. It is one of the foundational texts behind the research driving this script. If you want to truly understand the machinery behind what you are watching, you need this book on your shelf. And while you are there, take a moment to look at the rest of the collection. We have put together a curated line of dark memorabilia designed for people who want their obsession with history to live in their physical space, not just on a screen. Open the shop. Look around. The narrative continues while you browse. Pilate bled out on a wooden floor in Gaul. Antipas drowned in his own lungs in the Pyrenees. The Roman administrators who had processed the execution had been scraped off the face of the empire one by one. But the men who had actually driven the cart that morning, the high priests who had stood in the courtyard and turned the machinery of Rome into a weapon against a Galilean preacher, were still breathing. They still sat in the temple. They still wore the robes. They still held the keys to the golden sanctuary in Jerusalem. They believed they had won. They believed the stones of the Temple Mount would stand for another 1,000 years. They had no idea what was already marching toward them. They did not see the legions sharpening their iron in distant garrisons. They did not hear the engineers drafting siege plans. They did not feel the heat of the fire that was coming for the holy city. The priests had bought themselves 4 decades of silence. That silence was about to end with a sound the ancient world had not heard before. The illusion of victory in AD 33 was total. When the high priest Joseph Caiaphas and his father-in-law Annas walked back to their private compounds in the upper city of Jerusalem that Friday evening, after the body had been taken down from the cross and the crowds had dispersed, they were not haunted men. They were not standing at a window staring into the dark, wondering what they had set in motion. They felt the quiet, cold contentment of senior managers who had solved a problem before the problem solved them. They had identified a destabilizing element in the province. They had weaponized the apparatus of Rome to erase it. They had protected their exclusive control over the single most valuable piece of real estate in the ancient Near East. They went to bed that night, believing they had outmaneuvered history itself. What they had actually done was wind a clock that would keep ticking for exactly 37 more years before detonating and incinerating every member of their bloodline off the face of the earth. To understand the size of what was coming for them, you first have to understand what the temple in Jerusalem actually was. The word temple does it a disservice. It implies something quiet, spiritual, residential. The reality was closer to a fortified central bank dressed in religious iconography. The complex spanned 35 acres of elevated platform, the largest religious precinct in the known world at that time. It was faced in polished white limestone ashlars, some single blocks weighing over 400 tons, quarried from the hills around the city and dragged into position by teams of oxen and men over decades of construction. The eastern face of the sanctuary was clad in thick sheets of solid, hammered gold. When the sun cleared the ridgeline of the Mount of Olives at dawn, the reflected glare off those plates was so brilliant that pilgrims said a man could not look directly at the temple without shielding his eyes. It did not look like a building. It looked like a wound of light tearing open the side of a mountain. This monument of wealth was, in practice, a family business. The house of Annas ran it like one. Annas himself had served as the official high priest years earlier, but by the time of the crucifixion, he had moved into the role of patriarch, the man behind the throne. He installed his son-in-law, Joseph Caiaphas, as the sitting high priest, the public face of the operation. Over the next several decades, 5 of Annas's own sons would eventually wear the sacred breastplate and blue mantle of the high priesthood. It was a dynasty in all but name. They ran it like a financial cartel. Every adult male Jew anywhere in the diaspora was required by religious law to send an annual half-shekel tax to the temple every year. That tax could only be paid in a specific coin, the Tyrian shekel, prized across the region for its unusually high silver purity. The Annas family controlled the money changers who sat at the gates converting foreign currency, and they charged exorbitant spreads on every transaction. They controlled the board of inspectors who examined sacrificial animals for blemishes. These inspectors routinely rejected perfectly healthy lambs, goats, and doves brought in by pilgrims, forcing the travelers to buy pre-approved substitute animals from licensed temple vendors at 3 and 4 times the street price outside the walls. They were aristocrats hoarding silver in a country where most children ate lentils twice a day if they were lucky. They built their justification on theology. They belonged to the Sadducee sect, a priestly faction that taught that material prosperity was a visible expression of divine approval. If you were wealthy, God liked you. If you were poor, you had earned it. The execution of the preacher from Galilee was, in their eyes, a matter of pure risk management. His presence in the temple courtyards, overturning the tables of the money changers and denouncing the commercial operation on sacred ground, had the potential to trigger a mob. A mob in the temple precincts meant Roman auxiliaries storming in to restore order. A Roman intervention meant blood on the marble and a full audit of temple operations. An audit meant disruption of the cash flow. Caiaphas himself famously made the argument on record that it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. When you strip away the theological robe he wrapped that sentence in, you are looking at a line from a quarterly earnings call, and the historical irony is unbearable. His pure economic pragmatism in AD 33 became the seed of the radical movement that, 40 years later, would reduce his family's golden bank to white ash. Over the next 3 decades, the political temperature in Judea did not simmer. It climbed. The Roman procurators sent to replace Pilate became steadily more corrupt, more brazen, and more destructive. Men like Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus treated the province not as a territory to administer, but as a personal extraction racket. They sold judicial verdicts to the highest bidder. They openly shook down villages for silver. They extorted ransom payments from families whose sons they had arbitrarily arrested. The high priests responded to this chaos by clinging tighter to the very empire that was looting their people. They hosted Roman officers at long lamplit banquets in the upper city. They dressed in imported Tyrian purple and Alexandrian linen. They walked through the streets surrounded by phalanxes of Thracian and Syrian bodyguards armed with heavy clubs. With every year that passed, they became less recognizable as spiritual leaders and more recognizable as a local puppet class. The population stopped seeing them as priests and started seeing them as collaborators. That tension produced a new kind of weapon for the streets. They were called the Sicarii. The Sicarii were not soldiers. They did not drill. They did not wear armor. They were an urban assassination guild, and they pioneered a form of political killing that modern intelligence services still study. Their name came from the Sica, a short, inward-curving iron dagger just long enough to slip past a rib and puncture an internal organ. They operated exclusively in daylight, and they worked the densest crowds on purpose. A Sicarii operative would walk into the swell of pilgrims during a major festival, cloak pulled loose over his shoulder, Sica hidden against his forearm. He would identify his target. He would drift through the crowd until his shoulder brushed the victim's side. He would drive the blade upward under the ribs into the liver, twist, and withdraw it in one motion, the whole sequence taking less than 2 seconds. The target would collapse, clutching himself. The assassin would immediately cry out in horror, point at nothing, and dissolve into the stampede of panicked bystanders running for the exits. By the time order was restored and the body was identified, he was already 2 streets away, his cloak already changed. The House of Annas had used the threat of an uprising as the political lever to kill a single preacher. Now, an actual uprising was methodically killing the House of Annas. The Sicarii scored their most devastating hit in AD 56. Their target was Jonathan, a son of Annas, who had also served a term as high priest. Jonathan was walking through the temple precincts, surrounded by his personal detail of bodyguards. The assassins had studied the rotation. They slipped through the security perimeter in the crowd. They struck in the shadow of the sanctuary itself, at the foot of the stones their own family had laid. The high priest bled out onto the sacred marble, clutching his side, his bodyguards screaming for help that arrived too late. The killers vanished into the pilgrim traffic. The psychological aftershock was enormous. The ruling elite understood in that moment that their wealth, their Roman patrons, and their private armies could not protect them inside the walls of their own holy site. Jerusalem began to fracture from the inside out. The streets became a landscape of paranoia and private violence. Prominent citizens hired rival gangs of mercenaries to settle land disputes with knives instead of courts. The high priests sent armed enforcers into the countryside to forcibly seize agricultural tithes directly from the threshing floors before the lower rural clergy could collect their lawful share, leaving village priests literally starving while the aristocracy in the upper city hosted banquets on silver platters. The whole system was now cannibalizing itself in real time. The match that lit the final fire arrived in the spring of AD 66. The Roman procurator that year was Gessius Florus, a man whose greed was remarkable even by Roman standards. Florus arrived in Jerusalem announcing that the imperial treasury was short of funds and that he required a contribution. He marched into the temple courts with an armed escort and formally demanded 17 talents of solid gold from the sacred treasury. The population did not riot. Not yet. Instead, they deployed a weapon of surgical public humiliation. Young men ran laughing through the streets of the upper city, carrying beggars' baskets, passing them through the crowd, theatrically calling for coppers to support the poor, impoverished Roman procurator who apparently could not afford to eat. Florus did not find the street theater funny. He ordered his heavy infantry into the upper market to make an example. The legionnaires did not arrest the pranksters. They initiated a methodical civilian slaughter. They kicked in the doors of private homes. They dragged out entire families and ran them through with short swords in the street. They seized prominent Jewish citizens, including several men who held Roman citizenship and equestrian rank, and they hauled them before Florus. He ordered them flogged with lead-tipped whips, their backs open to the bone, and then he had them crucified in the center of the market. Over 3,000 civilians were butchered in Jerusalem in a single afternoon. The gutters ran thick. The high priests panicked and pleaded with the survivors to submit, to accept the punishment, to not escalate. They begged the population not to give Rome any further excuse. It was too late. The tactical cowardice that had defined the ruling class for 30 years had finally lost its authority. The radical factions, long held back, now seized the Temple Mount. They made one operational decision that could not be undone. They halted the twice-daily sacrifice that had been offered on the altar on behalf of the Roman emperor. That sacrifice was not a religious gesture. It was a diplomatic protocol. Ending it was the ancient equivalent of formally severing relations. It was a declaration of war. Rome answered immediately. Cestius Gallus, the legate of Syria, mobilized the 12th Legion Fulminata and marched south at speed. He expected to wrap up the rebellion in a few short weeks. He arrived with roughly 30,000 infantry, auxiliary cavalry, siege engines, and the cold imperial confidence of a general facing a disorganized provincial uprising. He reached the outer walls of Jerusalem. He probed the defenses. He made preparations for a siege. Then, for reasons historians still argue about, he abruptly ordered a full retreat. The Jewish rebels came after him. They chased the armored legion out of the Judean hills and funneled them into the tight, stepped pass at Beth Horon, a narrow defile with steep ridges on both sides where Roman heavy infantry tactics were effectively useless. The rebels rained javelins, slingstones, and rolled boulders down from the cliffs above. The orderly retreat disintegrated into a panicked rout. 6,000 Roman soldiers were cut down in the pass. The rebels captured the 12th Legion's artillery train. Most humiliating of all, they captured the Legion's sacred golden eagle standard, the Aquila, the living spirit of the unit. It was the worst defeat a Roman army had suffered anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean in over a century. The men who had orchestrated the execution of a single provincial preacher 37 years earlier specifically to avoid provoking Rome were now locked in total war against the greatest military machine that had ever existed. The news reached Emperor Nero, who was at that moment performing lyre poetry at a festival in Greece. He stopped mid-verse. He dispatched his most ruthless battlefield general Vespasian, along with Vespasian's son Titus, with explicit orders to erase the province of Judea from the imperial map. While the legions gathered their iron in the north, Jerusalem itself descended into a civil war so savage that by the time Rome finally arrived, the Romans would simply be finishing what the city had already begun doing to itself. The city split into warring factions. The official moderate government was led by Ananus ben Ananus, yet another son of the original patriarch Annas. He was a realist. He understood correctly that the legions were coming, and that Jerusalem could not defeat Rome in a straight siege. His plan was to fortify the walls, stockpile food, and open discreet back-channel negotiations for a conditional surrender that would preserve the city and the temple. He was violently opposed by a warlord named John of Gischala, a Galilean commander who had fled south after the Roman advance crushed his home region. John allied himself with the Zealots, a faction of radical religious purists. The Zealots held an apocalyptic theology. They preached that God would miraculously intervene to save the holy city, but only if it were first cleansed of every collaborator, moderate, and suspected traitor inside its walls. They seized the inner courts of the temple and converted the holiest site in Judaism into a forward operating base. They drank the sacred wine intended for liturgical use. They slept on the floor of the priestly chambers. They established archer positions on the roof parapets of the sanctuary. They fortified the outer colonnades with barricades. Ananus ben Ananus rallied the terrified civilian population of Jerusalem. He armed anyone who could lift a blade, and he laid siege, incredibly, to his own temple. The moderates fought their way through the outer courts, pushing the zealots back behind the heavy bronze doors of the inner sanctuary. Ananus had them completely sealed in. He set up a rotating perimeter guard. His plan was simple: starve them out. What he did not understand was how far John of Gischala was willing to go. Under cover of darkness, John smuggled messengers out of the sanctuary through hidden access points. They slipped past the moderate pickets. They rode south through the hills to the region of Idumea, carrying a forged letter. The letter alleged that Ananus ben Ananus was a Roman asset, preparing to open the city gates and hand Jerusalem over to Titus. It begged the Idumeans to come and save the temple before the betrayal was complete. The Idumeans were descended from the ancient Edomites, a tough, semi-nomadic people with a tradition of ferocious military service and a deep personal stake in the defense of the Jerusalem temple. The letter worked. They mobilized roughly 20,000 heavily armed men and began marching north at forced pace. They arrived at the walls of Jerusalem in the middle of winter, AD 68. Ananus saw the army massing on the horizon. He immediately ordered every city gate sealed. He climbed up onto the wall and tried to reason with the Idumean commanders from the parapet. He explained that the letter was a lie. He explained that the zealots inside the sanctuary were the true defilers. The Idumeans did not trust him. They did not open hostilities, but they refused to leave. They pitched an angry, suspicious camp in the rain outside the walls, convinced they had been shut out by a traitor. That night, the sky ripped open. Contemporary sources describe it as one of the most violent winter storms in the region's memory. Sheets of freezing rain sliced sideways through the streets. Thunderclaps hammered the limestone foundations of the Temple Mount. Wind tore shutters off windows. The moderate sentries patrolling the walls and the outer courts huddled into doorways and under overhangs, abandoning their posts to escape the freezing downpour. The city's defenses went effectively unmanned. Inside the sanctuary, the trapped zealots had been waiting for exactly this. They produced iron saws. They crept to the massive bronze-hinged doors that sealed them in. The thunder masked the grinding of metal teeth chewing through the hinges. The doors gave way. A small team of zealots slipped out, moved undetected through the flooded, abandoned streets, crossed to the southern gate of the city, and began sawing through the bolts of the main city gate from the inside. The wind drowned out every sound. Not a single moderate guard woke up. The gate swung open in the storm. 20,000 Idumean fighters flooded into Jerusalem in the dark. They linked up with the zealots at the Temple Mount. Together, they drew their swords and began the work. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination. The combined force moved through the outer courts, slaughtering the moderate guards where they slept, still wrapped in their cloaks against the cold. The marble floors of the temple precincts, the same floors where Jonathan had bled out a decade earlier, turned slick with a mixture of rainwater and arterial blood. The attackers hunted down the moderate leadership by name. They dragged Ananus ben Ananus out of his private quarters, still half-dressed. The grandson of the patriarch who had signed off on the execution in AD 33 was thrown face down on the stones. They cut his throat in the street. They did not stop with the leadership. The mixed zealot and Idumean force fanned out into the residential districts of the upper city. They kicked in doors. They executed anyone even suspected of sympathy with the moderate government. The ancient historian Josephus, who lived through and documented this war, records that 8,500 bodies were left piled on the Temple Mount by sunrise. The blood sluiced down the massive southern steps of the temple, mixed with the rainwater still running off the platform, and poured into the Kidron Valley below in a red torrent visible from a distance. In the morning, the victors committed the final desecration. They took the corpses of Ananus ben Ananus and the other murdered high priests. They stripped them completely naked. They dragged them to the edge of the walls. They threw them over. The aristocratic dynasty that had ruled Judea, controlled the temple economy, and dictated the terms of divine favor for 3 generations was left exposed in the ravines outside the city walls, picked apart by the feral dogs that lived in the garbage pits. The House of Annas was extinct. The entire ecclesiastical machine that had demanded the nails in AD 33 had been methodically executed by its own people in AD 68. And the real horror had not even begun. The Romans had finally arrived. It was the spring of AD 70. Vespasian had already left the field, recalled to Rome to claim the imperial throne for himself during the chaos of the Year of the 4 Emperors. He handed the completion of the Judean campaign to his son Titus. Titus rode up to the walls of Jerusalem with 4 full legions at his back. The 5th Macedonica, the 12th Fulminata, rebuilt from the survivors of Beth Horon and hungry for vengeance, the 15th Apollinaris, and the legendary 10th Fretensis. Combined with auxiliary forces and allied contingents, he commanded somewhere north of 60,000 men, along with hundreds of pieces of siege artillery. Titus surveyed the immense fortifications of Jerusalem and did the math. A direct frontal assault would cost him thousands of Roman lives and could easily bog down for months. He chose a different strategy. He chose to strangle the city to death. He ordered his engineers to construct a wall of circumvallation. In 3 days, the legions stripped the entire Judean landscape. They cut down every single tree within a 10-mile radius of the city, transforming the surrounding hills into a bare moonscape of stumps. They used the lumber to build a continuous earthen wall reinforced with timber, completely encircling Jerusalem. No grain shipment could enter. No refugee could slip out. The noose was closed and locked. Inside the walls, the situation was already catastrophic before the Romans even arrived. The internal factional warfare between John of Gischala and a newer rival warlord named Simon Bar Giora had included the deliberate burning of each other's grain storehouses during their power struggles. Both sides had destroyed the city's strategic food reserves in the process of fighting each other. When the Roman circumvallation wall went up, the city was already running on empty. It was instantly plunged into a terminal famine. The starvation that followed is one of the most horrifying recorded episodes in the ancient world. At first, wealthy families traded gold coins for a single handful of raw wheat, then ate it in locked back rooms, chewing silently so that no neighbor would hear them and report them to the rebel militias who had declared hoarding a capital offense. When the wheat gave out, the population moved to leather. They tore the hides off their shields and cut them into strips to boil and chew. They ate their belts. They boiled old sandals until the leather softened enough to swallow. They ate dried grass. They ate the straw from their roofs. The streets began to fill with the dead and the dying, but the rebel factions specifically forbade public mourning. Anyone caught weeping openly for a starved family member was executed on the spot as a defeatist. Bodies were dragged into empty houses and left there to rot, or simply thrown over the city walls into the ravines below, where they accumulated in visible mounds. Desperate citizens began slipping out of the city at night to forage for roots and wild greens in the valleys outside. Titus anticipated exactly this. He ordered the auxiliary cavalry to patrol the perimeter continuously. Any civilian caught outside the walls was brought back to the Roman camps. What he did with them became one of the most horrific psychological operations in ancient military history. Titus did not simply execute the captured foragers. He ordered them scourged first, their backs and thighs laid open with lead-tipped whips until the flesh hung in strips. Then he crucified them. The Romans set up the crosses on the ridges directly facing the city walls, so that the defenders on the parapets could see the execution line clearly. They crucified men, women, adolescents, small children. They arranged the bodies in deliberately grotesque postures, some upside down, some in pairs, as visual humiliation. They crucified roughly 500 Jews every single day. They eventually ran out of wood. The hillsides around Jerusalem had been stripped for the siege wall, and then they were stripped again for the crosses, until the landscape itself became a forest of rotting human bodies hanging on timber, a vast, silent echo of the single execution the city's priests had orchestrated 40 years earlier on the hill on the other side of the walls. The tactic was supposed to break morale. It backfired completely. The defenders on the walls looked out at their own relatives suffocating on the ridges and concluded that surrender meant torture. They decided to die fighting instead. In July, the Romans finally breached the Antonia fortress, the massive military garrison complex that overlooked the temple platform from its northwestern corner. From that foothold, the final phase of the war moved directly into the sanctuary itself. The combat inside the temple was nightmarish. It was hand-to-hand, in the tight marble colonnades of the outer courts, where Roman infantry formations could not deploy properly. The legionnaires slipped constantly on blood-slicked pavement. The defending rebels, fully aware they were dying for the holy site itself, fought with a suicidal frenzy that unnerved even veteran Roman officers. They threw themselves bodily onto extended Roman short swords to drag down individual legionnaires so their comrades could finish the job. Titus, watching the bloodbath mount with no end in sight, ordered the outer gates of the temple complex set on fire to break the defensive line. The silver plating on the gates melted in the heat. The heavy cedar beams behind it caught and collapsed inward. On the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, a date still observed as a day of mourning in Jewish tradition, the Roman line finally pushed into the inner courtyard. The sanctuary proper rose above them, its eastern facade clad in those massive sheets of hammered solid gold, a monument to the accumulated wealth of the priestly dynasty that had already been wiped out by its own people 2 years earlier. Titus, according to the sources, had given explicit orders to preserve the building. The gold alone was worth more than many provinces produced in a decade. But command and control break down inside an urban combat zone. Always. A single Roman soldier, exhausted, bleeding from a leg wound, deafened by screams, his judgment cooked by the heat of the burning gates, picked up a still-burning length of cedar timber from a collapsed doorway. He did not wait for orders. He turned to the nearest comrade. He put his hands on the man's shoulders. He gestured upward. The soldier was hoisted into the air on the comrade's clasped hands. He reached the height of one of the smaller golden windows set into the outer wall of the sanctuary near the roofline. He shoved the burning wood through the opening. The interior of the sanctuary was a fire engineer's worst nightmare. It was packed with ancient cedar paneling that had been drying out for decades. It held enormous linen veils, layers of them. It housed standing reservoirs of olive oil for the menorah and for ritual anointing. The thrown torch landed in that environment and ignited instantly. The fire fed on the oil, then jumped to the veils, then climbed the cedar paneling, then roared up into the roof structure. The sealed stone walls trapped the heat and concentrated it. Within minutes, the interior temperature surpassed what any organic material could withstand. The defenders watching from the outer courts saw flames pouring out of the small windows at the top of the Holy of Holies. Their lines collapsed psychologically. They dropped their weapons mid-combat. Some of them ran directly into the burning sanctuary, choosing to die inside the temple rather than survive its destruction. The legionnaires surged through the suddenly undefended courts. They cut down priests performing final rites at the altar. They cut down civilians who had fled there, hoping for divine protection. They killed until the blood pooled around the base of the sacrificial altar and ran in sheets down the steps. And then, the real destruction began. The temperature inside the burning sanctuary kept climbing until it crossed the melting point of ancient gold alloys. The massive hammered plates that lined the walls began to soften. The metal lost its structural hold on the stone. It liquefied. A river of molten, glowing gold began pouring down the interior walls, sheeting across the marble floor, mixing with the still warm blood of the slaughtered priests, and running into every crack between the foundation stones. The entire cedar roof collapsed with a sound that was heard miles away. A deep, reverberating crack followed by a rolling concussion. The whole 35-acre complex became a single roaring furnace. The heat was so intense that Roman soldiers had to physically retreat from the outer colonnades. They stood on the distant ridges and watched the religious and financial center of the Jewish world burn down to fine white ash. When the fires finally died out days later, and the stones had cooled enough to be approached, the legions began the final act. They brought up iron crowbars and wooden levers. They began systematically prying the massive limestone blocks of the temple platform apart, stone by stone, because molten gold had seeped down through the cracks and into the joints during the fire, and the only way to recover it was to take the building apart. They left nothing standing. The gospel prophecy about no stone being left upon another was fulfilled not by divine wrath, but by Roman soldiers chasing gold with crowbars. The execution in AD 33 had been a calm political calculation. The men who authorized it believed they were cutting a single inconvenient branch to preserve the tree. What they did not understand was the physics of the imperial machine they had invoked. The paranoia they leveraged infected the emperor, who ratified it and smothered him to death under woolen blankets in his own bed. It chased Pilate into the freezing forests of Gaul and left him face down in his own blood on a wooden floor. It hounded Antipas into the muddy foothills of the Pyrenees to drown in his own lungs. It turned the holy city's own factions against each other and soaked the courts of the temple with the blood of the very dynasty that had demanded the nails in the first place. And finally, it summoned the legions themselves, who arrived to harvest the gold from the walls and left the architects of the crucifixion scattered as ash across the Judean hills. Every single hand that had touched that morning in AD 33 had been systematically and specifically erased within a single human lifetime. The empire that had been used as a weapon simply turned around and consumed the men who thought they owned it. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. This channel exists because of the engagement of the people watching right now. Hit the subscribe button. Smash that like. Send this to the one person in your life who needs to understand the real, unvarnished geopolitical weight of what history actually is. You just watched another premium long-form documentary from Ancestral, the dark history hub of YouTube. Now, look at the screen. Click the video appearing in the center of your display right now. That is your next descent into the archive. Don't close the app. The story keeps going.